All right. Hello, friends, and welcome once again to our Community-Centered Development Foundation's mini course. Today, we're going to be talking about the wholeness principle. I love this principle so much. I think it's one that so often gets overlooked, and it's absolutely imperative for our community-centered development work. So let's dive in. All right, our wholeness principle, here's how we define it. When everyone is included in the community building process, including the weak, the poor, and the voiceless, the increase in cooperation, sharing, and trust will ultimately lead to a healthier and more resilient community. I love thinking about these verses from 1 Corinthians from the Christian tradition that talks about the human body as a metaphor for flourishing community. So I'm going to go ahead and read that. A body isn't just a single part blown up into something huge. It's all the different but similar parts, arranged and functioning together. If the foot said, "I am not elegant like the hand, embellished with rings, I guess I don't belong to this body," would it make it so? If the ear said, "I am not beautiful like the eye, transparent and expressive, I don't deserve a place on the head," would you want to remove it from the body? If the body was all eye, how could it hear? If all ear, how could it smell? As it is, we see that God has carefully placed each part of the body right where he wanted it. And each part not only has value, but it's vital to the fullness and functioning of the whole community. The wholeness principle is all about ensuring that all voices are included on a community development process. We're especially wanting to ensure that the voices of the marginalized, the vulnerable, any of the voices that would usually be overlooked are included and invited into the process. When we ensure that all voices are included, we activate citizenship and ownership, which is another principle we'll talk about in a few weeks, within our communities. And this inclusion, which fosters citizenship, is mutually beneficial, both for the community and the individual. That's usually overlooked, right? Having all voices fortifies the community and cultivates a sense of belonging and agency among each person, bringing out the best of what they have to contribute to a process. So I'm going to pass this over to Jamie, who's going to dive a little bit deeper into this principle.
Yeah, thanks, Kendra. Some of you are familiar with John McKnight, and he's sort of one of the pioneers of community-centered development. He's an American. He really talks about wholeness as a real power source of effective community-centered development. He says this: at the heart of our movement are three universal and abundant powers that enable communities to fulfill their functions. So we're going to look at those three powers, and every community has the potential for abundance, but abundance doesn't happen accidentally. It needs to be unlocked, and really that's what McKnight is getting at here. So it's three kind of keys towards unlocking this power, and they all have to do with wholeness. The first one is the power of generosity. So in community-centered development, we often talk about discovering assets, and we know that every community is a treasure box filled with various kinds of assets. But these assets only become powerful when they're shared with others. So generosity has the ability of multiplying. And so that leads to abundance, having more than enough as a community. And a spirit of generosity in a community is contagious, the attitudes, the motivations that go along with it. When you receive a gift from someone, whether it's service or time or wisdom or even something practical that they give you, it sparks generosity inside of you, and you have a desire to give back or even pay it forward. The second one is the power of association. When we recognize and establish associations in our community, places of shared affinities or shared interests, places where people share values or share a vision for what the future should look like, those associations become powerful carriers of our generosity. So if you think of generosity like electricity, that's this power that pulses through our community. Associations are like the power lines that take that electricity all around and throughout the community and even beyond your community. And so it has a way of magnifying or amplifying that electricity, directing assets and skills and abilities and ideas of the community in ways that are helpful and productive. And then the third one is the power of inclusion. Often we view those in our community as a glass half empty. Maybe you say, oh, that person has nothing to offer, or maybe they do, but they're not really like me. I'm a little bit hesitant to ask them to get involved. You know, they're different. That person's from a different tribe or, you know, religion, or maybe even just a different gender or walk of life. A stranger. In our culture, we sometimes use the word stranger danger. You know, be careful around strangers. Be careful around people that are suspicious or different from you. But in community centered development, strange can be beautiful if we can sort of unlock that potential. It has the ability to take us to new and surprising places beyond the limitations of who we know and what we know. And, you know, as I was going through this teaching, kept coming to mind this group that's actually a part of this course that we're doing now, which is Progress and Peace in Iraq. And, you know, these guys are a mix of different ethnic groups and religious backgrounds, but because of their willingness to put their fears and uncertainties of each other, kind of the stranger danger, they put that aside. And, you know, they say, hey, let's focus on our affinities. Let's focus on the things that we agree upon. Let's focus upon our shared vision. Let's focus on the reality that when we work cohesively together, we can work out of an abundance. And because of that, there's a powerful movement for change that they have. And so as volunteers, they've given generously towards their cause. So you have the spirit of generosity that we've talked about. They've recognized the power of association by coming together with shared hopes and dreams. And then the power of inclusion, as I've just spoken about. They've maximized their power by having an inclusive mindset, choosing to see the best in each other. And so in the next slide, you'll see one guy who I've gotten to know. And the first time I met him was in 2014, almost 10 years ago. And he's a leader of a community in Kamplooka, which is a slum in Kinshasa in Congo, very poor area. And we've got some Africans with us that probably know this community. And, you know, really early on through the work of some of our 5 and 2 members there in Kinshasa, Odon Gilles and Delphine from Kamplooka, from the Bon Berger Clinic, they began to work with them to discover assets and see what they had. It's an amazing kind of success story of a community that starts with what they have. And so they were trained in community-centered development, and they just felt inspired to start with what they have, which is the first step. Is kind of find that low-hanging fruit and begin. And, you know, they had no money, very little money. And so they focused on projects that demanded primarily just time and labor. And what was interesting about that is that everyone could be involved. You know, everybody has, you know, can find something to do when it's just, you know, finding work, whether that some of the women were, you know, getting some food together, some men were doing labor, and even the children were involved in that. And the first thing they did was they decided to do an anti-erosion process where they had a lot of erosion, where the water in rainy season was just coming through and flooding their community. So they went around the city and they dug up these deep-rooted plants and they transported them back to their community. And, you know, this was a real success story, and you can see it in this picture here. If you just go back one slide, he's just proudly showing off these anti-erosion plants. And then you see in the next one here, they collected rainwater. And so from the roof there, you can see the rainwater comes down in the cistern, and then they've got some potable water, drinking water for the community. So that was their next successful project. They did a number of beautification projects, painting the church and the school. And you can see here, they're making bricks for building projects. So these are all voluntary community projects. And I went to visit them after some time. I was really amazed to see all of the number of things that they did, and even planning for the future, other ideas that they had mapped out to do ahead of them. But the one interesting thing that I want to mention now is this final aspect of the story, and this lady right here, and what a difference she made in the community. She was probably one of the poorest people in the whole community. She was a charcoal dealer, which doesn't bring in much income. And they had decided, the community, that they wanted to build an extension to the church. And so this is the biggest challenge that they had taken on as a church. But they were not successful in getting the money together in order to do it. And so then they had kind of given up on the project, until this one lady came along and she gave $200, which was really, would have taken her a lifetime to accumulate that little nest egg that she had. And just with a real faithful heart and a generous heart, she gave the entirety of her savings towards this project. And what was amazing, I talked earlier about generosity, how it promotes more generosity and how contagious that is. And so everybody looked at her gift, and they said that they were really emboldened to give. And that was the difference. And so here you have a picture of wholeness, where it's the least likely person to make a contribution to the project was the linchpin, was the bridge towards making it happen. And so you really see a picture of the power of wholeness when everyone is included. And so we want to move towards comparing this idea of a whole-centered approach to community development to more of a self-centered approach. And there's a quotation there. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go further, go together. And I mean, friends, if we're really honest about wholeness, it sounds good in theory, but do we really want wholeness? Do we really want to get everyone involved? Imagine you're trying to solve a community problem. Let's say it's a lack of water. Who are you going to invite to the strategic table? Strong leaders, probably people with influence, people who are educated, people who are physically strong, influential. Why would we include people with no influence, with no connections, no knowledge? Well, here's the key question in it all. Do you want to solve a community water problem, so a short-term objective, or do you want to build a healthy and functional community that's built for long-term effectiveness and impact? And so you can see here the difference between a short-term approach and a long-term approach. Before we can really talk about wholeness, we need to go back to the objective. What are we trying to achieve? A community that is activated and interdependent and flourishing, active citizens who are caring about their community and engaged in the betterment of their community. And so taking a wholeness approach, it's kind of like building an engine so your community can go wherever it needs to go, right? Taking a self-centered or a short-term approach is, in a way, it's like pushing the vehicle from point A to point B. And so in some ways it's moving slower and working together to build an engine that's going to take your community further in the long term. So I'm going to turn it over to Daniela.
As Jamie said before, that African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go farther, go together, reminds me of trying to teach my kids chores. It would have been way faster for me to just done the chores myself. I'm quicker with it. I know how to do it. But I took the time to do it with my kids, teach them how to do it, to walk alongside with them. And we got to a place where now we can actually get more work done in 1 week because we all do our parts and we all have the part to play together. So in that spirit, we can do community work with the whole in mind. Or we can go back to our default and do it with ourself in mind. Often we think we're being whole-centered until we actually start breaking down our actions. So I want us to together look through some of these actions and ask ourselves, what kind of a community are we? Are we taking a self-centered approach, or are we taking a whole-centered approach? So the first thing that I want to talk about is the duration, the success. Like I said with the chores, in a self-centered approach, it's faster, it's short term. While as in a whole-centered approach, it's long-term, and you're thinking about the long haul. In people participating, Jamie mentioned it before, that often in a self-centered mindset, we start looking for whoever's the strongest, the dominant ethnicity. Usually it's mostly male. Often it's the educated and the wealthy and the dominant faith. Whereas when we look with the whole-centered approach, we're thinking about multi-ethnic, like Jamie's example with Progress and Peace. We're including men and women, non-educated and educated, all levels of strength, including the weak and the vulnerable. We're looking at a varied economic status. Kendra, do you mind going to the next screen? And we're looking at a varied faith perspective. So you can see those listed here. Now, the next one, when we're doing a self-centered approach or a whole-centered approach, what is our community mentality? In a self-centered approach, we say power decides, where in a whole-centered approach, we say we are in this together. Self-centered usually is characterized with the mentality of competition, exclusiveness, individualistic tendencies, rights and entitlements. Whereas in a whole-centered approach, the characteristics of this kind of a mindset is more cooperation, inclusivity, collectivity, and responsibility. What are some actions that are taken when we're thinking more in a self-centered type of a way as a community? Usually we would see actions like controlling behavior, hoarding. People are suspicious and envious. We're blaming others, or we don't care and we're indifferent. And we're thinking about our independence. Whereas in a whole-centered approach, there's a spirit and actions of generosity, hospitality, trust. People are forgiving each other, empathizing, and we're working together in collaboration. So what are the results? Well, in that self-centered way of doing things, we say, this is mine, an individual's benefit. It does then start to increase a power divide, community distrust occurs, and in the end, it's community dissatisfaction. And what about in a whole-centered approach? The result is us as a community saying, this is ours, and everyone's benefiting. We have increased community spirit, confidence shared together, and community affection and loyalty. So when we're thinking in this kind of way, what activities promote each approach? Well, in a self-centered approach, the activities that promote self-centeredness would be information gathering, where we start with the ideas of the powerful, then we delegate people and start importing resources, and those with power end up doing the planning, the action, and the evaluating. In the whole-centered approach, the information gathering starts broadly with community-wide stories and surveys, remembering all of our successes. And then we start connecting people and assets to each other. And it ends up being that those in the inclusive process and with democratic planning do the actions and the evaluating. So we will talk more about this in our session later, but I want you to think about your own community and ask yourself, where are we? I'm sure it's not one or the other. You might fall somewhere in between on each of these categories. But the idea is, how can we move from a more self-centered approach to a more whole-centered approach? I'll pass you on to Kendra, who will talk a little bit more about some barriers.
Thank you, Daniela. Of course, when we talk about the whole-centered approach, it's so beautiful, right? Thinking about including everybody's voices. But as Jamie said, if we're honest, we know barriers truly do exist, right? So we just want to list a few here, and then we're going to discuss this in a little more detail together, because I'm sure as we're going through this, you're thinking about your context and what might make this principle more challenging. So we are looking forward to talking about that together and learning together. But some barriers that exist, we're going to just look at three: inequity, broken relationships, and self-centeredness and pride. So inequity, this is different than equality, right? I know we agree that the value of wholeness is important in achieving healthy and functional communities. But of course, obstacles for each individual could be different depending on their context or their capability or different capacities. So we just want to take a quick note to differentiate between equality and equity. Equality is providing the same supports for everybody, right? Everybody gets the same thing, which on first glance seems like it's fair. But of course, as you can see in this image, and as you know from your life, right, that it's not always fair that way. Equity is different. It takes into account what each person has, what each person's capabilities are, what their vantage points are, and it provides the supports that are going to lead to true equity, the same result. So as you can see in this image here, it's giving the shorter person the bigger stand, right? Or the taller person the shorter stand, so that they can all reach the apples, okay? So that's a little bit of a note, a difference between equality and equity absolutely can be a barrier to bringing all voices in and embodying the wholeness principle. Excuse me. The second barrier is broken relationships. Right? Conflict is normal, it's natural, it's a very real reality in our communities, but conflict can lead to broken relationships, not understanding one another, not having freedom flowing in communication between people. Lisa Sharon Harper, the author of many books, including The Very Good Gospel, talks about peace, true, just peace, being the right connection and relationship, whole, flourishing relationships, everything working together as it should, which brings us back to that idea of the body. So broken relationships, disrepair, and conflict can be a barrier to the wholeness principle in our communities, can be a barrier for people's voices being heard. And this is where all of our peacemakers will have something really valuable to share in this conversation when we talk this week. And one other barrier we wanted to mention is self-centeredness and pride. Daniela just took a deep dive into this. But when we're only concerned with our own flourishing, our own capacity building, and we're not thinking about bringing everybody else along, that's pride, that's selfishness, and that's a very true human trait that can be a barrier to wholeness in our communities. Those are just three. Of course, the list could be larger. So if you're hearing this and you think about your own context, we want you to come prepared. What are some challenges that you see in your own community that could be a barrier to using this principle and including all voices in your context? I'm going to pass it over to Jamie, who's going to wrap this up for us.
Yeah, it's a tough road towards wholeness because, as Kendra points out here, it demands sacrifice, and it's playing the long game and not the short game. And I want to move towards a conclusion here. And I just want to ask this question: what are the results of wholeness? And this kind of gives a little hope in terms of, okay, we're making some sacrifices with this principle. What are the outcomes? And the one key one is active citizenship. And so we become citizens when we feel we have agency in our lives to change our communities. We're inviting people to have agency, a sense of belonging, a sense of ownership in the community. And out of that comes a genuine concern and the skin in the game that we talk about, where people are engaged, willing to make sacrifices and willing to make change because they have an ownership in it. And so that's active citizenship. And then the other one is functionality, right? Like functional communities. As each person finds that space and the courage to apply their gifts and their ideas, then the community becomes more functional. You know, so previously you may have had to look outside the community for projects or funding or services and provisions. That's the traditional, typical default mechanism that we have, is looking outside. But when active citizens are engaging in healthcare, security, childcare, stewarding the environment, then change is happening internally. And that's what wholeness leads us towards. A whole community is like an engine that functions effectively. And so in conclusion, I want you to just imagine a small fire, you know, a few sticks being burnt. And this picture that some of our African friends actually brought this image, this metaphor to our attention. And it's just so beautiful to think about more and more people coming along, not just warming up by the fire, but bringing a piece of wood and adding that to the fire and watching the fire grow and increase. But growing fire is useless unless it actually does something, right? So, you know, cooking food, warming people's bodies, and creating energy, right, to build and develop things. And so in the same way, when each person in the community brings their gifts to the table, there's a growth in energy, there's a growth in opportunity, motivation, ideas, and ultimately in hope. And that's what we want to bring to our community. So that, my friends, gives you a picture of the power of the wholeness principle.